You don't know what you're digging up, boy. The old man's hands were shaking as he said it, his eyes fixed not on Ethan but on the twisted blackened frame buried under 3 decades of rust and silence. That bike killed a man, and it'll kill whoever touches it next. Ethan Brooks just stood there staring at the wreck like it was the only thing left in the world that still made sense. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to wake up something that 400 men on steel horses had spent 26 years praying would finally see daylight. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes the truth always finds its way to the surface no matter how long it takes, no matter how many powerful men try to bury it, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled by the time it's over. Now let's go back to where it all began, in a town most maps forgot, on a morning that would change everything. Red Hollow, Montana didn't wake up so much as it groaned. The kind of town where the diesel trucks idled outside the diner before 6, where old men nursed the same coffee for an hour just to have somewhere to sit, and where everybody knew everybody's business except the things that actually mattered. Ethan Brooks had lived there his whole life, and some mornings he hated it with a passion that scared him, and other mornings he loved it so much his chest ached. That particular morning, standing in the doorway of Brooks & Son Auto Repair, with a stack of unpaid bills clutched in his fist, he didn't feel much of anything except exhaustion. "Ethan, honey, you didn't eat breakfast again." His mother, Carol, stood behind him in her worn housecoat, her voice carrying that particular blend of worry and forced cheerfulness that mothers perfect after they've buried a husband and are terrified of losing the only thing they have left. "I'm not hungry, Mom." He didn't turn around. He was staring at the red stamp on the top envelope. Final notice. The bank didn't care that his father had built this garage with his own 2 hands. The bank didn't care that Frank Brooks had died with grease under his fingernails and pride in his heart, having never missed a single payment in 20 years. The bank only cared about the 90 days of silence since Ethan had taken over. 90 days of him bleeding money, trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep customers coming, trying to be half the mechanic his father was and failing every single time. "They can't just take the house," Carol said, and there was a tremble underneath the words that broke something in Ethan's chest. "They can, Mom, and they will if I don't come up with $11,000 by the end of the month." He finally turned to look at her, and God, she looked so small standing there, so much older than her 51 years, like grief had aged her twice as fast as time was supposed to. "I'm gonna fix it. I promise you I'm gonna fix it." He didn't know how. That was the terrifying part. 22 years old, no college degree, a garage that was hemorrhaging money, a mother who cried herself to sleep some nights when she thought he couldn't hear her, and absolutely no idea how he was going to pull $11,000 out of thin air in the next 30 days. But he said it anyway, because that's what you do when the person you love most in the world is looking at you like you're the only thing standing between her and losing everything. That afternoon, Ethan drove out to Miller's salvage yard on the edge of town, chasing a rumor that old Pete Miller was finally clearing out the back lot, the section that had been fenced off and condemned since before Ethan was born. Pete had always been cagey about that part of the yard, always found a reason to steer customers away from it. But words around town was that the county had finally forced his hand pay to clean it up or lose the whole property. "You sure you want to be back here, kid?" Pete asked, and his voice had an edge to it that Ethan had never heard from the old man before. Pete Miller had sold Ethan's father parts for 20 years. He'd known Ethan since he was in diapers. But right now, standing at the rusted gate that led into the condemned section, Pete looked like a man standing at the edge of something he didn't want to think about. "I heard you're finally clearing this section out. I'm looking for parts, Pete. Anything I can salvage and resell, anything I can use for repairs. I'm desperate here." Ethan didn't bother hiding it. There was no point pretending with a man who'd known his family his whole life. Pete's jaw worked for a moment like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "There's things back there that should stay buried, Ethan. I mean that. It's a junkyard, Pete. Everything back there is already dead." "Not everything." Pete's eyes flicked toward the back corner of the lot, toward a shape under decades of tarps and collapsed shelving that Ethan couldn't quite make out. Some things just looked dead. Ethan should have listened. He would think about that moment 1,000 times in the weeks to come, the way Pete's hands had trembled just slightly as he unlocked the gate, the way the old man refused to walk more than 10 feet past the threshold, like there was an invisible line he wasn't willing to cross. But desperation has a way of making warnings sound like superstition, and Ethan Brooks was a desperate man. He found it under 3 layers of rotted tarp buried beneath a collapsed shelf of rusted transmission parts, half swallowed by 26 years of Montana dirt and neglect. At first he thought it was just scrap another dead machine waiting to be melted down. But when he pulled back the last of the tarp and saw the shape of the frame, the curve of the tank, something in his chest went very quiet. "Pete." His voice came out different than he meant it to. "Pete, get over here." Pete didn't move from the gate. "What is it?" "It's a panhead, a 48 panhead, I think." Ethan crouched down, running his fingers along the frame, feeling the pockmarks and gouges in the metal that his mechanic's brain immediately recognized as something other than rust damage. "Pete, these are bullet holes." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Ethan turned to look at the old man, and what he saw stopped him cold. Pete Miller, 68 years old, a man who'd wrestled engine blocks bigger than most men for 4 decades, was white as a bedsheet. "Leave it," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leave it right there and walk away, son." "Pete, this is a piece of history. Do you know what a restored 48 panhead is worth? This could be everything I need. This could save the house." "That bike has been sitting there for 26 years because nobody wants it, Ethan. Nobody. You understand what I'm telling you." Pete's hands were shaking now, visibly, and Ethan had never in his life seen the old man look scared. "There's things that come with that bike that ain't worth any amount of money." "It's a motorcycle, Pete. It's not cursed." Ethan almost laughed, except the look on Pete's face didn't leave room for laughter. "I didn't say cursed. I said things come with it. You start pulling that bike apart, you're going to find things that some very dangerous people wanted to disappear a long time ago." Pete took a step back, actually took a physical step back from the bike like it might reach out and grab him. "I've had that thing sitting under a tarp for 26 years because the man who brought it in here told me if anyone ever asked about it to say I never saw it. And 2 weeks later, that man ended up dead in a ditch on Route 9, and the sheriff called it a hunting accident, even though it was July and nobody hunts in July." Ethan felt something cold slide down his spine, but the number $11,000 was still flashing behind his eyes, and desperation is a hell of a filter for fear. "That was 26 years ago, Pete. Whoever was involved is probably dead or gone by now. You don't know that. I know that this bike is sitting in a junkyard falling apart, and I know that I need money more than I need to be scared of ghost stories." Ethan stood up, brushing the dirt off his hands, and looked at Pete with a determination that surprised even himself. "I'll pay you for it. Whatever you want." Pete Miller stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like grief. "Take it for free," he said finally. "I don't want a dime for it. I just want it off my property, and I want you to promise me one thing." "What's that?" "If you start finding things in that bike papers, anything hidden, you bring them straight to me before you show anybody else. You understand?" Pete's eyes were wet, and wet was something Ethan didn't understand, yet something that would take weeks to fully surface. "Promise me that." "I promise," Ethan said, though he had no idea what he was promising or how heavy that promise would become. It took 3 men and a flatbed trailer to get the panhead back to the garage. And by the time Ethan had it sitting under the fluorescent lights of his father's shop, something had already changed in the air of Red Hollow, though nobody could have said exactly what. Carol came out to the garage that evening, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw the bike. "Where did you get that?" "Miller's yard. I got it for free, Mom." Ethan couldn't keep the excitement out of his voice, the first real excitement he'd felt in months. "Once I restore this thing, it could be worth $30,000–$40,000. Maybe more depending on what's original." Carol didn't move from the doorway. Her eyes were fixed on the bike with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. "Your father used to talk about a bike like that." Ethan's hands stilled on the handlebars. "What do you mean?" "There was a story way back before you were born about a group of bikers who used to come through Red Hollow. Your father knew some of them back when he was young and wild before he settled down and opened this place." Carol wrapped her arms around herself, and Ethan noticed for the first time that she'd gone pale. "One of them disappeared, just vanished one night, and everybody said he ran off, but your father never believed that." "Mom, this is a coincidence. Oh, there's 100 old Harleys out there. Not with bullet holes in the frame, there aren't. Carol's voice was sharp now, sharper than he'd heard in a long time. Ethan, please. I just buried your father 2 years ago. I can't survive burying anything else. Nobody's burying anybody, Mom. I'm restoring a motorcycle to save our house. That's all this is. He said it with as much confidence as he could muster. But even as the words left his mouth, some part of him, some quiet animal, part buried deep in his gut, knew he was lying to both of them. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan crept back down to the garage with a flashlight, unable to resist the pull of the machine sitting under the tarp he'd thrown over it. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew he couldn't stop thinking about the bullet holes, about Pete Miller's shaking hands, about his mother's pale face. He ran his fingers along the frame in the dim light, feeling every dent and scar. And that's when his fingers caught on something that shouldn't have been there, a seam in the metal near the base of the seat that didn't match the rest of the frame's construction. His heart started pounding. Mechanics know their machines. They know when something's been welded, when something's been added, when something doesn't belong. This seam was too clean, too deliberate. Someone had modified this bike after the fact, had created a hidden compartment where none should exist. His hands were shaking now, too, matching Pete Miller's tremor from earlier that day as he worked a flathead screwdriver into the seam in pride. It took nearly 10 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold garage, before the panel finally gave way with a groan of metal that sounded impossibly loud in the silent night. Inside, wrapped in a decayed oilcloth that crumbled at his touch, was a set of dog tags tarnished nearly black with age. Ethan held them up to the flashlight, his breath catching in his throat as he read the stamped letters. Jacob Harrison. Beneath the tags, tucked into the same hidden compartment, was a small stack of photographs, their edges curled and yellowed, showing a group of men standing proudly beside their motorcycles. Leather vests, patches Ethan didn't recognize, arms slung around each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of brothers. One man stood in the center of every photograph, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that seemed to light up even the faded photo paper. Ethan flipped one of the photos over and found handwriting on the back, faded but legible. Jacob and Cole Sturgis, 1997. Brothers for life. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the dog tags in his hand, the weight of them suddenly feeling like far more than a few ounces of tarnished metal. Somewhere out there, 26 years ago, a man named Jacob Harrison had ridden this bike, had laughed with his brothers in these photographs, and had then simply vanished, leaving behind bullet holes and hidden compartments, and a whole town too afraid to speak his name. The garage door creaked, and Ethan nearly dropped the flashlight, his heart slamming against his ribs. But it was just the wind rattling the old hinges his father had never gotten around to fixing. Still, his hands didn't stop shaking as he carefully returned the tags and photographs to the compartment, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through everything Pete had said, everything his mother had said, turning the dog tags, because he had in the end taken them with him, unable to leave them in the garage over and over in his hand like a worry stone. Jacob Harrison. Who was he? What had happened to him? And why did a small, insistent voice in the back of Ethan's mind keep whispering that whatever had happened 26 years ago wasn't finished yet? The next morning, he made a decision that would set the next several weeks of his life on fire. He decided to keep digging. He started at the library first, an old brick building 3 blocks off Main Street that hadn't updated its microfiche machine since the Clinton administration. The librarian, a kind but nosy woman named Ruth, who'd known his family for decades, raised an eyebrow when he asked about old newspaper archives from 26 years back. "What are you looking for, Ethan?" "Anything in particular?" "Just doing some research on local history," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the truth either. Local history from '98, that's an oddly specific year. Ruth studied him for a moment, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken under her gaze. "That was a strange year in this town, if I remember right. A lot of folks left after that summer. A lot of folks stopped talking about certain things." "Like what?" Ruth's expression shuddered the same way Pete's had at the salvage yard. "You should ask your mother," she said, and turned back to her filing, effectively ending the conversation. Ethan spent 3 hours scrolling through microfiche, his eyes burning from the flickering screen, before he found what he was looking for, a small article buried on page 7 of the Red Hollow Gazette, dated August 1998. Local biker reported missing. The headline, read in type, so small it seemed almost deliberately understated. The article was barely 4 paragraphs describing Jacob Harrison, age 29, as having last been seen leaving a bar on the outskirts of town before vanishing. The sheriff's department, the article noted, had found no evidence of foul play and considered the case likely voluntary disappearance. Voluntary disappearance. Ethan stared at those two words for a long time. A man leaves bullet holes in his motorcycle frame and hides dog tags and photographs in a secret compartment. And the official explanation is that he just decided to walk away from his life. He printed the article, folded it carefully into his jacket pocket, and drove straight to the one person in town he suspected might actually tell him the truth. Walter Reyes, a Vietnam veteran who lived alone on the edge of town, and who Ethan's father used to visit every few weeks, bringing him groceries and sitting with him on the porch for hours, though Ethan had never known what they talked about. Walter answered the door, slowly leaning on his cane, and his face went through a series of expressions when he saw Ethan standing there, surprise, warmth, and then something that looked almost like dread. "Ethan Brooks, been a while, son. How's your mother?" "She's doing okay, Mr. Reyes. I actually wanted to ask you about something." Ethan held up the folded newspaper article, and he watched Walter's eyes drop to it, watched the old man's weathered face go still. "Do you know anything about a man named Jacob Harrison?" The silence stretched long enough that Ethan thought Walter might close the door in his face. Instead, the old veteran let out a slow breath, the kind of breath a man releases when he's been holding it for 26 years. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found his dog tags in a motorcycle I bought from Pete Miller's salvage yard." Walter's cane trembled against the porch boards. "The panhead," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of dread confirmation. "Lord Almighty, that bike's still around. You knew about it." "Everybody who was around back then knew about it, son, and everybody who was smart stopped talking about it real quick." Walter's eyes darted past Ethan, scanning the empty street behind him, with the practiced paranoia of a man who'd learned to watch his surroundings in a jungle half a century ago. "Come inside, quickly." Once inside, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, an action that sent a fresh wave of unease through Ethan's chest, Walter lowered himself into his recliner and stared at Ethan with an intensity that made him feel like a teenager again, small and unprepared for whatever truth was about to be handed to him. "Jacob Harrison was a good man," Walter said finally. "One of the best I ever knew. Rode with a club brothers who'd do anything for each other, and Jacob was smarter than all of them combined. He wasn't just a biker, son. He was investigating something. Land deals, corruption, real ugly stuff involving some very powerful people in this county." "What kind of corruption?" "The kind that gets people killed." Walter's voice dropped even lower. "I was a deputy back then. Did you know that before I did 2 tours and came back different? I saw the file on Jacob's disappearance before it got buried. Saw things that didn't add up. Blood evidence that got lost. Witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. A sheriff who closed the case faster than any case I'd ever seen closed. Why didn't you say something?" Walter's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Son, I had a wife and a baby daughter at the time. 2 weeks after I started asking questions, somebody put a dead rattlesnake in my mailbox with a note that said, 'Mind your own business.' I minded my own business real quick after that." He looked away, shame and old fear mixing in the lines of his weathered face. "I've had to live with that for 26 years. Jacob Harrison had a brother, you know. National president of a motorcycle club. A man like that doesn't just let his brother disappear without turning over every rock in the country looking for him. Then why didn't he find anything? Because whoever made Jacob disappear made sure there was nothing to find. No body, no evidence, no bike." Walter stopped himself, his eyes widening slightly as the realization hit him. Except there was a bike, the whole time, sitting in Pete Miller's yard. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Pete told me to bring him anything I found before I showed anyone else." Pete Miller's known about that bike for 26 years and never said a word to a living soul. That tells you something about how scared people still are. Walter leaned forward, gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles went white. "Ethan, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever you found in that bike, whatever you're planning to do with it, you need to think long and hard about whether you're prepared for what happens next. Because if Jacob Harrison was murdered for what he knew, and that motorcycle is proof of it, then the people who killed him are either still alive or their children are, And they've had 26 years to make sure this town stays quiet. So what am I supposed to do? Just put the tags back and pretend I never found them. Walter studied him for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind the fear in his eyes. Your father was a good man too, you know. Frank never talked about it, but I think he suspected things back then. I think that's part of why he threw himself so hard into that garage, why he kept his head down and worked and never asked questions. He shook his head slowly. You've got his stubbornness, though. I can see it in your eyes right now. You're not going to let this go, are you? I don't think I can, Ethan admitted, and saying it out loud made it feel more true than it had felt even an hour before. There's a man out there somewhere, or was, who deserves the truth to come out. And there's a family somewhere who spent 26 years wondering what happened to their brother. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was a decision in them. Then you're going to need more than dog tags and a rusted bike, son. You're going to need proof, real proof. And if I remember right, there was talk back then of journals. Jacob kept records of everything he found. If those still exist, they'd be the key to everything. Where would I even start looking? That bike, Walter said. If there's one hidden compartment, there might be more. Jacob was careful. He wouldn't have hidden everything in one place. He reached out and gripped Ethan's arm with surprising strength for a man his age. And son, whatever you do, don't tell anyone in this town what you're looking for. Not your friends, not the sheriff Wobody. You don't know who's still connected to what happened back then. You don't know who's watching. Ethan left Walter's house with his mind spinning, the weight of everything he just learned settling into his chest like a stone. He drove home in silence, the radio off, replaying every word Walter had said. And when he pulled into the driveway of the garage, something made him stop the truck a half block early and sit there watching. There was a black SUV parked across the street from his house. Tinted windows, engine running. It hadn't been there when he left that morning. His heart began to hammer against his ribs as he watched the vehicle, waiting to see if it would move, if the driver would step out, if anything at all would happen. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing did. The SUV just sat there silent and watching, and Ethan realized with a sick lurch in his stomach that whoever was inside that vehicle was watching his house. He forced himself to drive the rest of the way to the garage, forced himself to park in the driveway like nothing was wrong, forced himself not to look at the SUV as he walked inside. But his hands were shaking as he locked the door behind him, and for the first time since he'd pulled that motorcycle out of Pete Miller's condemned scrapyard, Ethan Brooks truly understood, that Walter Reyes hadn't been exaggerating. Someone out there already knew what he'd found. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat in the dark of the garage with the lights off, staring at the shape of the panhead under its tarp, listening to every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the windows. His mind cycling endlessly through the same terrifying question. What had he gotten himself and his mother into? The answer came faster than he expected, and it came in the form of a knock at the garage door at 11 o'clock the next morning. Not the police, not Pete Miller, not Walter Reyes, but a man in an expensive suit that looked wildly out of place in Red Hollow, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Brooks, the man said, extending a hand Ethan didn't take. My name is Richard Kessler. I represent a private collector interested in vintage motorcycles. I understand you recently acquired a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead. Ethan's blood ran cold. How do you know about that? Word travels fast in a small town. Kessler's smile widened, but there was something predatory underneath it, something that made every hair on Ethan's arm stand up. My client is prepared to offer you $20,000 for the bike, as is no questions asked, with the stipulation that you cease all restoration work immediately and hand over the vehicle by the end of the week. $20,000, nearly double what he needed to save the house. Ethan stared at the man, his mind racing, every rational part of his brain screaming at him to take the deal to solve his problems and walk away from whatever dangerous truth he'd stumbled into. But something in Kessler's eyes, something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of the kind of casual interest a real collector would show, made Ethan's stomach twist with a certainty he couldn't ignore. That's a strange offer for a bike that's barely more than scrap metal right now, Ethan said carefully, watching Kessler's expression for any crack in the smooth facade. My client has a particular fondness for the model, sentimental value. Kessler's eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward the garage door behind Ethan, toward the shape of the tarp-covered motorcycle visible through the gap. "I'd encourage you to consider the offer seriously, Mr. Brooks. Sometimes the best decision a man can make is to walk away from something before it becomes more trouble than it's worth." The threat wrapped in polite corporate language hung in the air between them like smoke. Ethan felt his jaw tighten, felt the same stubborn fire that Walter had recognized in his eyes flare up hot in his chest. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Kessler, but I'm going to have to decline." Kessler's smile finally faltered, just for a fraction of a second replaced by something sharper, colder. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice dropping the pleasant veneer just slightly. "My client doesn't respond well to disappointment. I'd urge you to reconsider before this Friday. Offers like this don't stay on the table forever, and neither does my client's patience." He turned and walked back to his car. Not the black SUV from the night before, Ethan noted, but a silver sedan, just as sleek and out of place, and drove away without another word, leaving Ethan standing in his driveway with his heart pounding and a cold sweat breaking out across his back. He went straight back into the garage, locked the door, and pulled the tarp off the panhead with trembling hands, running his fingers over every inch of the frame with newfound urgency. If Kessler's client was willing to offer $20,000 for a burned-out wreck, there had to be more hidden in this bike than just a set of dog tags and some old photographs. Walter had said Jacob was careful. Jacob wouldn't have hidden everything in one place. It took him nearly 2 hours of careful searching, running his hands over every weld and seam, before he found the second hiding spot, this one cleverly disguised inside the fuel tank itself, accessible only through a false bottom that required draining what little remained of 26-year-old gasoline sludge to discover. Inside, wrapped in wax paper that had somehow survived the decades intact, was a folded map of the county marked with red ink circles around dozens of parcels of land, and a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but legible, filled with cramped, urgent handwriting. Ethan's hands shook as he opened the journal to the first page, and the date stopped his heart cold. March 1998, 5 months before Jacob Harrison disappeared. He began to read, and as he did, the full weight of what he'd stumbled into began to crash over him like a wave he had no hope of swimming against. This wasn't just a motorcycle. This wasn't even just a mystery. This was a man's last testament, written in the shadow of his own approaching death, documenting a conspiracy so deep and so dangerous that it had claimed his life and buried the truth for 26 years. And somewhere out there, a man named Richard Kessler and whoever he worked for had just made it clear that they knew Ethan had found it and that they would do whatever it took to make sure it stayed buried for 26 more. Ethan sat on the cold concrete floor of his father's garage, the journal trembling in his hands, and for the first time since this all began, he understood with absolute clarity that there was no going back. Whatever happened next, whatever danger came knocking at his door, he was going to find out the truth about Jacob Harrison, if it was the last thing he ever did. He had no idea, sitting there in the dim fluorescent light, with his mother sleeping peacefully upstairs, that 400 miles away in a clubhouse that most people in Red Hollow had never even heard of a phone was about to ring. That would change absolutely everything for him, for his town, and for a man named Cole Harrison, who had spent 26 years refusing to give up hope that his brother's disappearance would finally be answered. That night, as Ethan finally allowed himself to close his eyes, exhausted beyond measure, he didn't hear the soft click of a camera lens through his bedroom window, didn't see the dark figure crouched in the shadows of his own backyard, photographing the garage, the house, and every window with methodical, practiced precision. The war for the truth about Jacob Harrison had already begun. Ethan Brooks just didn't know yet that he was standing directly in its path and that the storm gathering on the horizon was far larger and far more dangerous than one broke mechanic in a small Montana town could possibly imagine. The camera's shutter clicked twice more before the figure melted back into the tree line behind the garage, and inside Ethan Brooks slept without knowing that his own backyard had become a surveillance zone. He woke at 5:30 the next morning to his phone buzzing against the nightstand, and when he saw the caller ID, his stomach dropped straight through the floor. Pete Miller. "Ethan!" Pete's voice was ragged, breathless, like he'd been running. "Ethan, you need to get down here right now." "Pete, what's wrong? It's 5:30 in the morning. Someone broke into my office last night, tore the place apart. Filing cabinets dumped, my computer smashed." Pete's breathing was uneven, and underneath it, Ethan could hear something close to panic. "They were looking for records, son. sale records, anything that would show what I gave you. Ethan sat bolt upright in bed, his heart slamming. Did they take anything? There was nothing to take. I never wrote anything down, remember? No paperwork, no receipt, nothing. I made sure of that 26 years ago, and I made sure of it again with you. A pause heavy with fear. But they don't know that, and now they know I know something. Ethan, I think you need to call the sheriff. The sheriff who wrote Jacob Harrison's disappearance off as voluntary. That sheriff, silence stretched long on the line. That was the old sheriff. Ray Doyle's been gone 8 years. You think his replacement is any different? You think whoever's still protecting this thing after 26 years just retired quietly and let a stranger walk in clean? Ethan was already pulling on his jeans phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear. Pete, lock your doors. Don't tell anybody what happened. I'm coming to see you, but not until I figure out what to do with what I found. What did you find? Ethan hesitated. Walter's warning rang in his ears. Don't tell anyone. Not the sheriff, not your friends, nobody. But Pete had known about this bike for 26 years and had never sold him out, had in fact refused $20,000 of nothing to make it disappear off his lot. A journal, Ethan said finally. Jacob Harrison's journal, and a map with land parcels marked on it. Pete, this goes deeper than a missing biker. This is corruption. Real ugly government-level corruption. Pete made a sound on the other end of the line that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I knew it. 26 years I've known there was something rotten sitting under that tarp, and I never had the guts to look. You've got more nerve than sense, boy, just like your father. Pete, I need you to think back. 26 years ago, when the man brought that bike to your yard, what did he look like? Did he say anything? Anything at all that might help? There was a long pause, and Ethan could practically hear Pete dragging the memory up from wherever he'd buried it. He was young, scared out of his mind, but trying not to show it. Said his name was Jacob, said he needed the bike gone, said if anybody asked, I never saw him. Pete's voice cracked. He said one more thing before he left. He said, if anything happens to me, tell them the truth is in the metal. I never understood what that meant until you called me an hour ago telling me you found a hidden journal. The truth is in the metal. Ethan felt a chill roll down his spine that had nothing to do with the early morning cold. Jacob Harrison had known back in 1998 that he might not survive whatever he was investigating, and he'd built a coffin of secrets into the very bones of his motorcycle, trusting that someday somehow the right person would crack it open. Pete, I have to go. I need to read this journal before anything else happens. He hung up and sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, journal in his lap, sunlight just beginning to creep gray through the curtains. Downstairs, he could hear his mother moving around the kitchen, the clink of a coffee mug, the familiar creak of the third stair that never stopped complaining, no matter how many times his father had tried to fix it. Normal sounds, a normal morning. And Ethan sat there holding a dead man's last words, feeling like the walls of that normal life were already starting to crack. He opened the journal to the first entry and began to read in earnest. March 3rd, 1998. Cole thinks I'm crazy for chasing this. Maybe I am. But Danny Fuentes is dead and everybody's calling it a farm accident, and I've seen the man's land contract. He didn't sign it. Somebody signed it for him after he was already in the ground. Ethan's breath caught. He kept reading. March 19th. Found 3 more. All small landowners all along the same corridor near the river. All dead within 18 months of each other. All their land ended up in the same holding company. Gerald Whitmore's name is on every single one of the follow-up sales as the buyer's attorney of record. Gerald Whitmore. The name meant nothing to Ethan yet, but the way Jacob had written it, underlined twice with pressure, hard enough to nearly tear the page, told him everything he needed to know about how much that name had mattered to a dead man 26 years ago. He read for nearly an hour, and the story that emerged from those cramped, urgent pages was worse than anything he could have imagined. Jacob Harrison hadn't stumbled onto some small-time land scam. He'd uncovered a systematic pattern spanning almost a decade, elderly farmers and small landowners along a strategic river corridor dying under suspicious circumstances. Their land quietly sold off through forged signatures and coerced deals, funneled through shell companies that all traced back to the same handful of names. Judges who'd approved probate cases with almost supernatural speed. A county assessor who'd suddenly retired to a lake house he couldn't possibly have afforded on his salary. And at the center of it all, orchestrating the entire machine with the practiced patience of a spider building a web, Gerald Whitmore. The last entry in the journal, dated 4 days before the newspaper article said Jacob had vanished, was the one that made Ethan's hands go cold. August 11th, 1998. I have enough now. Names, dates, the land parcels, everything. I recorded Whitmore on tape 2 nights ago at the Blue Anchor, thought he was talking to his lawyer. Had no idea I was in the booth behind him. If something happens to me, Cole needs to know I wasn't running from anything. I was running toward the truth, and I was almost there. Tell my brother I love him. Tell him not to stop looking, because I know these people, and I know they don't stop either. Ethan closed the journal, his hands trembling, and for a long moment he simply sat there in the gray morning light, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was holding. A recording existed. Somewhere, if it had survived 26 years, there was an actual recorded confession from Gerald Whitmore, and Jacob Harrison had hidden it somewhere before he disappeared forever. The truth is in the metal. He was back in the garage within minutes, tearing into the panhead with a new kind of desperation, checking every seam, every weld, every possible hiding place, with the frantic energy of a man racing against the clock he couldn't see. He found the third compartment, just past 7 in the morning, hidden inside the modified oil tank, wrapped in 3 layers of waterproof canvas that had somehow kept moisture out for a quarter century. A small analog cassette recorder. Its casing cracked but intact with a single tape still loaded inside. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Ethan, Carol's voice from the garage doorway made him jump nearly out of his skin. She was standing there in her robe, coffee mug in hand, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between concern and dawning horror. What is that? He should have lied. He knew he should have lied, should have protected her from all of this the way his father would have wanted him to, but the words came tumbling out before he could stop them. The journal, the map, the dead farmers, Gerald Whitmore, the recording that might be sitting in his palm right now. Carol's coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. Mom, 26 years. Her voice was barely a whisper, and her face had gone the color of ash. Ethan, your father knew Gerald Whitmore. The room seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. What? Not well, but they crossed paths back before you were born, when your father was young and rode with some rough crowds before he settled down. Carol's hands were pressed to her mouth now, her eyes wide with a fear that had clearly been buried for decades. I remember him coming home one night, white as a sheet, and he told me a friend of his had disappeared, and he thought some very dangerous men were involved, and he made me promise never to ask him about it again. I thought he meant some bar fight, some old grudge. I never thought, you knew Dad was scared of something and you never told me. I didn't know what it was. He never told me the details, Ethan. He protected me from. It's just like I've been trying to protect you. Carol's voice cracked, tears spilling freely now. Your father spent the rest of his life keeping his head down, working himself into the ground in this garage, never causing trouble, never asking questions because he was terrified of whatever he saw back then. And now you're standing here holding a murdered man's confession tape like it's nothing. Ethan crossed the garage and pulled his mother into his arms, feeling her shake against him, feeling 26 years of buried family fear finally breaking the surface. I have to see this through, Mom. I can't put this back in the ground now. Too many people already know I have it. Then we're not safe, Carol whispered against his shoulder. None of us are safe. She wasn't wrong, and the proof of it arrived less than 3 hours later in the form of a second visit from the black SUV, this time parked directly in front of the garage, no longer even pretending to be subtle, engine idling, tinted windows reflecting the pale morning sun like a warning. Ethan watched from the garage window, the cassette recorder hidden now inside a rolled-up shop towel tucked into his father's old tool chest, his pulse hammering in his throat. The SUV sat there for nearly 10 minutes without a single door opening, without a single sign of movement, and the sheer deliberate menace of that stillness was somehow more terrifying than if someone had simply gotten out and confronted him. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the SUV pulled away, and Ethan realized he'd been holding his breath the entire time. His phone rang 30 seconds later. Unknown number. Mr. Brooks, Richard Kessler's voice smooth and cold as ever. I understand you had an interesting morning. Pete Miller's office was a terrible thing, break-ins. This town used to be so quiet. So, you did that? Ethan said, his voice shaking with fury he could no longer contain. You broke into an old man's office and terrified him half to death. I did no such thing, Mr. Brooks. I'm merely a concerned party checking in on an investment opportunity. Kessler's tone was almost cheerful, which somehow made it worse. I wanted to extend my client's offer one final time. $30,000 now, a very generous increase given the circumstances. I'd take it if I were you. My client is growing considerably less patient by the hour. Tell your client that I know about Gerald Whitmore. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. But Ethan heard everything he needed to hear, and in it a hitch, a catch, the sound of a man realizing the situation had just changed. When Kessler spoke again, the pleasant veneer was gone entirely. That was a mistake, Mr. Brooks, a very serious mistake. The line went dead. Ethan stood in the garage with the phone still pressed to his ear, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. And he understood in that moment that there was no more pretending this was a negotiation. He had just declared war on people who had already killed once to keep their secret buried, and he had no army, no protection, nothing but a dead man's tapes and a stubborn refusal to back down. That night, the fire came. It started just after midnight, a smell of gasoline and smoke pulling Ethan out of a restless half-sleep. And by the time he'd thrown on jeans and sprinted downstairs, the back corner of the garage, the storage room where his father had kept spare parts for 20 years, was already engulfed orange light flickering violently against the windows. Mom, call 911. Ethan grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall, but even as he sprayed it uselessly at the flames, he knew it wasn't going to be enough. Knew this fire had been started with something more than a dropped cigarette or a faulty wire. The smell alone told him that. Someone had poured accelerant along the base of that wall and lit it deliberately. Carol came stumbling down the stairs in her nightgown, phone already pressed to her ear, screaming their address to the dispatcher. And Ethan kept fighting the flames with everything he had terrified beyond words, that the fire would reach the main bay, where the pan had sat, where the recorder was hidden, where everything Jacob Harrison had died trying to preserve could be turned to ash in minutes. The fire department arrived 12 minutes later, and by the grace of God, or perhaps simply because the storage room was separated from the main bay by a cinder block firewall his father had insisted on building decades earlier, the flames never reached the motorcycle. But by the time the last ember was extinguished, half the garage's storage capacity was a smoking ruin. And Ethan stood in the driveway at 2 a.m, soot-streaked and shaking, staring at the wreckage of his father's life's work. This was arson, the fire chief told him, bluntly, crouching by the scorched threshold with a flashlight. Accelerant patterns clear as day. Somebody wanted this building to burn, son. You got enemies I should know about. Ethan looked at the man for a long moment, weighing Walter's warning against the simple, undeniable fact that his family's home had just nearly burned to the ground. I don't know, he lied, because some warnings apparently were harder to ignore than others, especially with his mother standing 3 feet away, trembling, tears streaking through the soot on her face. The chief studied him a moment longer, clearly not believing the lie, but he didn't push. I'll file the report. Sheriff's Department will probably want to talk to you tomorrow. He straightened up, glancing toward the main garage bay, where the shape of the panhead was faintly visible through the open door. Nice bike you got in there. Lucky it didn't catch. Lucky, Ethan repeated hollowly, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Carol didn't sleep the rest of that night, and neither did Ethan. They sat together at the kitchen table as dawn broke gray and cold over Red Hollow, the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes, their hair the inside of their throats. We should sell it, Carol said quietly, staring into a mug of coffee gone cold an hour ago. Ethan, please, take the $30,000. Save the house. Let this go before they burn it down with us inside it next time. Ethan wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to say yes so badly it physically hurt. Wanted to hand over the bike and the tapes and the journal and walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. Pretend he'd never crossed that condemned fence line at Miller's salvage yard. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jacob Harrison's cramped, desperate handwriting. Tell my brother I love him. Tell him not to stop looking. Somebody out there has spent 26 years wondering what happened to their brother, Mom, he said, finally, his voice hoarse from smoke and bar and exhaustion. If I sell this now, that family never gets the truth. Whoever killed Jacob Harrison gets to keep winning forever. And if they kill you, what happens then? Who's going to give me the truth about what happened to my son? Carol's voice broke on the last word, and Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, feeling it tremble in his. I have to see this through, he said again, quieter this time, but no less certain. But I'm not going to do it alone anymore. Whatever Walter Reyes knows, whatever else is out there, I need help. Real help. Not from the local sheriff, not from anybody connected to this town's old power structure. He spent the following 2 days moving like a man underwater, exhausted and hyper-aware, in equal measure jumping at every unfamiliar car that passed the garage, checking the locks 3 and 4 times before bed, watching his mother flinch at every knock on the door. The sheriff's department did come as the fire chief had promised, and the deputy who took the report, a young man named Collins, who couldn't have been more than a few years older than Ethan, asked a series of routine questions that felt anything but routine given everything Ethan now knew. Any idea who might want to target your property, Mr. Brooks? No idea. Ethan lied again, watching the deputy's pen hover over his notepad. A beat too long, watching something flicker behind the young man's eyes that might have been suspicion or might have been something closer to warning. You found an old motorcycle recently, is that right? Word travels in a town this size. Collins's tone was carefully neutral, but Ethan felt every hair on his arms rise. Interesting timing, a fire like this right after a discovery like that. Are you accusing me of something, deputy? No, sir, just an observation. Collins closed his notepad, and for just a moment, something passed across his young face that looked almost like sympathy, almost like a warning wrapped in professional distance. Small towns keep old secrets a long time, Mr. Brooks. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Just something to think about. He left without another word, and Ethan stood in the driveway watching the cruiser pull away, wondering just how deep the rot really went, wondering how many people in Red Hollow and the whole county had spent 26 years complicit in a silence built on murder. That evening, desperate and running out of options, Ethan finally did the one thing Walter Reyes had specifically warned him against. He went looking for a way to reach Jacob Harrison's family. If Jacob had a brother, a national president of a motorcycle club, as Walter had said, then somewhere out there was a man who deserved to know that his brother's final testament had just been pulled out of a Montana junkyard after 26 years buried in silence. He found the trail through the photographs, first the ones from the hidden compartment, the ones showing Jacob laughing with his arms slung around a taller, broader-shouldered man at what looked like a motorcycle rally. Sturgis, 1997. Brothers for life, the handwriting on the back had said. Ethan spent hours online that night cross-referencing old motorcycle club rosters, historical event photographs, anything he could find until finally well past midnight. He found a name that matched the man in the photograph, a name that appeared across dozens of news articles spanning decades tied inseparably to one of the largest and most notorious motorcycle organizations in the country. Cole Harrison. His hands trembled as he found what he was looking for. Not a direct contact, because men like Cole Harrison didn't exactly list personal phone numbers online, but a public post 3 years old on a memorial page dedicated to missing persons cases that had never been solved. Cole Harrison had written it himself, the words raw and unpolished, in a way that told Ethan this was a man who'd never once in 26 years allowed himself to stop hoping. My brother Jacob Harrison disappeared from Red Hollow, Montana in August 1998. He was investigating something he believed was dangerous, and I've never stopped believing someone made him disappear to keep him quiet. If anyone has any information, please, I'm begging you. My family deserves to know what happened to him. Ethan sat back from his laptop, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Grief for a man he'd never met, fury at a 26-year injustice, and a fear so sharp it made his hands shake as he began typing a reply. Mr. Harrison, my name is Ethan Brooks. I live in Red Hollow. I recently found your brother's motorcycle. I found his dog tags, his journal, and I believe a recording of the man responsible for what happened to him. I don't know who else to trust with this. Please, if this reaches you, contact me. He posted his phone number below the message, hands shaking so badly he had to retype it twice. And then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark of the garage, staring at the shape of the pan head under its tarp, wondering if he'd just done the bravest thing he'd ever done in his life or the most reckless. He didn't have to wonder long. His phone rang at 3:47 that morning, an unfamiliar area code, and Ethan answered it before the first ring had even finished, his heart already hammering. Is this Ethan Brooks? The voice on the other end was deep, rough, carrying a weight of controlled emotion that Ethan could feel through the phone line itself. Yes, who's this? My name is Cole Harrison. A long pause, and Ethan could hear the man's breathing on the other end, unsteady, like he was fighting to keep himself together. "You said you found my brother's bike." "I did." Ethan's own voice came out shaky. "Mr. Harrison, I found his dog tags first, then his journal. Then—" He hesitated, some instinct telling him this next part mattered more than anything he'd said so far. "Then I found a tape recorder. There's a cassette inside. I haven't listened to it yet. I think it might be evidence of exactly what happened to him." The silence that followed stretched so long, Ethan thought the call had dropped. When Cole Harrison finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. The raw emotion replaced by something harder, colder, more focused, the voice of a man who had spent 26 years waiting for exactly this moment and had already decided somewhere deep in his bones exactly what he was going to do with it. "Don't listen to it yet. Don't touch anything else. Don't tell anyone else what you have." A pause, and Ethan heard the sound of movement on the other end, a door opening, footsteps. "My brother didn't run away, did he? 26 years, and everybody told me to move on, told me he probably just wanted a different life. I never believed it for one single day." "He didn't run away, Mr. Harrison. I've read his journal. He was murdered because he found out about a corruption scheme, land fraud, and a man named Gerald Whitmore was at the center of it." Another silence, but this one felt different, heavier. More dangerous, like something enormous had just shifted into motion on the other end of the line. "Gerald Whitmore," Cole repeated, and the way he said the name slow and deliberate made Ethan's skin crawl. "I know that name. I heard it a long time ago, back when I was still tearing this whole state apart looking for my brother, and I could never make it stick to anything. Every lead just went cold." His breathing had gone rough now, ragged with something that sounded like fury finally finding a place to land after 26 years of having nowhere to go. "Ethan, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you and your family safe right now? Somebody set fire to my garage 2 nights ago. There's a black SUV that's been watching our house. A man offered me $30,000 to hand over the bike and stop asking questions." "Jesus Christ!" Cole's voice cracked just slightly, the first sign of the man beneath the hardened exterior. "They're already coming after you. Of course they are. 26 years, and they never stopped watching for exactly this, for someone to finally find what Jacob hid." A pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied into something Ethan would come to recognize over the following days. As the voice of a leader making a decision he'd already made 1,000 times before in his mind, waiting only for the moment it became real. "You're not alone in this anymore, Ethan Brooks. You hear me? Whatever happens next, you and your mother are not facing this alone. What are you going to do?" There was a pause, and in that pause, Ethan heard something shift in the very air around him, though he was 400 miles away from wherever Cole Harrison was standing at that moment. "I'm going to call my brothers," Cole said quietly. "All of them. And then I'm going to come to Red Hollow, Montana, and I'm going to make sure that every single person who had a hand in killing Jacob spends whatever years they have left understanding exactly what it means to underestimate the people who loved him." Ethan felt a chill that was equal parts terror and something close to relief, the terrifying comfort of realizing that the war he'd accidentally started was no longer his to fight alone. "How many brothers, Mr. Harrison?" Cole Harrison's answer came without a single second of hesitation, delivered in the flat, certain tone of a man who had already made the calls in his head 1,000 times over the years, waiting for a reason that had finally arrived. "However many it takes." The call ended, and Ethan sat in the darkness of his father's garage phone, still clutched in his trembling hands, staring at the shape of the panhead under its tarp, and understanding with a clarity that settled deep into his bones that everything about his life had just changed forever. He had gone looking for scrap metal to save his mother's house. What he had found instead was a war that had been simmering in silence for 26 years, waiting only for someone brave enough or desperate enough to finally strike the match. He didn't sleep again that night. Instead, he sat beside the motorcycle until the sun came up, one hand resting on the cold, scarred metal of the frame, and made a silent promise to a dead man he'd never met. "I'm going to finish what you started, Jacob. I don't know how, and I don't know what it's going to cost me, but I promise you the truth is coming out, and it's coming out soon." Outside in the gray light of dawn, the black SUV rolled slowly past the garage one more time, its driver watching, waiting, reporting back to people who had no idea yet that 400 miles away, a phone tree was already activating, engine after engine roaring to life, in driveways and clubhouses across half a dozen states, all of them converging on a single unshakable purpose that Gerald Whitmore and everyone protecting him could never have seen coming. The sun was barely over the ridgeline when Ethan's phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Cole Harrison. It was Walter Reyes, and the old veteran's voice carried a tension that hadn't been there 2 days before. "You called him," Walter said, not a question. "The brother, Cole Harrison." "How do you know that?" Because I've been making calls to son quietly to a couple of old contacts I still trust, and word moves fast when a name like Cole Harrison starts making noise." Walter's breathing sounded labored, like he'd been up all night. "You have any idea what you just set into motion?" "He said he's coming here, with his brothers." "His brothers?" Walter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ethan, do you understand what that club is? Cole Harrison isn't going to show up with 3 guys on Harleys looking for closure. That man commands respect across this entire country. If he calls people, answer. I need you to prepare yourself and your mother, because whatever's about to happen to this town, it's going to happen fast, and it's going to happen loud." Ethan swallowed hard. "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet," Walter admitted, "but I know Gerald Whitmore's people aren't going to just sit back and wait to see what happens. They've had 26 years to build walls around this. You think they're going to let a few hundred bikers just walk in and knock those walls down without a fight?" He wasn't wrong. By that afternoon, the fight had already found a new front, and it came from a direction Ethan hadn't even considered. 2 women in gray blazers showed up at the garage at 2 o'clock, flashing county health department credentials and clipboards, informing Carol in flat bureaucratic tones that they'd received a complaint about unsafe structural conditions following the recent fire, and that the property would need to be inspected before any further business could legally be conducted on the premises. "A complaint from who?" Carol demanded, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, months of grief and fear finally curdling into something sharper. "That information is confidential, ma'am," the older of the 2 women said, already stepping past her into the garage without waiting for permission, clipboard raised eyes scanning the walls, the wiring, the scorched storage room with an expression that looked less like genuine safety concern and more like a woman searching for an excuse. Ethan came around the corner from the main bay, just in time to see the second inspector's eyes land on the tarp-covered panhead, and something in the way she stared at it too long, too focused, not the casual glance of someone checking for fire code violations, sent alarm bells screaming through his skull. "Ma'am, that's private property, not part of the structural inspection. No. Everything in a condemned building falls under our jurisdiction, sir." The woman's voice was crisp, professional, and utterly fake. "We'll need to catalog all contents pending the safety review. This building isn't condemned." "It will be," the older woman said, snapping her clipboard shut with a note of finality that made Carol's face go white, "if we find what we're expecting to find. Given the fire damage, this could take weeks to clear, Mr. Brooks. Maybe longer. I'd suggest you find alternative arrangements for anything of value on the premises." The threat was so thinly veiled it barely qualified as a threat at all, and Ethan felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "You're not city inspectors. You're not even good actors." The younger woman's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before the older one cut in smoothly. "We'll be back Thursday with a full crew, Mr. Brooks. I'd encourage you to have your affairs in order." They left without another word, climbing into an unmarked sedan and pulling away, and Ethan stood in the driveway, shaking with a fury he'd never felt in his life. "They're trying to seize the garage," he said mostly to himself. "They can't get the bike by force, so they're going to condemn the whole building and take everything inside it legally." "Ethan," Carol's voice was small behind him, "this is getting worse, not better." "I know, Mom." He turned to look at her, and the fear in her eyes nearly broke him. "But Cole Harrison is coming. I have to believe that means something." That belief was tested within the hour when Ethan turned on the local news and found his own face staring back at him from the television screen, grainy and out of context, lifted from some old community fundraiser photo beneath a chyron that read, "Local man linked to suspicious property damage, ongoing investigation." Sources close to the investigation suggest Brooks may have staged the fire himself for insurance purposes, though the family has denied any wrongdoing. Neighbors report increasingly erratic behavior in recent days, including... Ethan snapped the television off his hands, shaking with a rage so pure it nearly blinded him. They're framing me. They're turning this whole town against me before Cole even gets here. Erratic behavior, Carol whispered, staring at the blank screen. Who told them that? Who's saying these things about you? The answer came unwelcome and unavoidable at the grocery store the next morning when Carol went out for milk and bread and came back 40 minutes later, ashen-faced and trembling, having been stopped by 3 separate acquaintances who'd asked her with poorly concealed judgment whether it was true that Ethan had been seen buying gasoline the night of the fire. They believe it, Carol said, setting the grocery bags down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Ethan people we've known for 20 years. People who came to your father's funeral, they're looking at me like I raised a criminal. This is exactly what Kessler wants. He can't stop the bike, so he's trying to destroy my credibility so nobody believes a word I say once the truth comes out. Ethan pressed his palms against his eyes, exhaustion and fury warring in his chest. We need to hold on, just a little longer. Cole said he was coming. When Ethan? Because I don't know how much longer I can stand outside my own home and watch neighbors cross the street to avoid me. He didn't have an answer for her not yet, and the not knowing gnawed at him through another sleepless night, through another day of watching the black SUV make its slow, deliberate laps past the garage, through another visit from Richard Kessler, this time not in person, but in the form of a manila envelope shoved under the garage door sometime after midnight, containing photographs of Ethan's mother at the grocery store at church walking to her car, each one stamped with a date and time in the corner, a silent, chilling message that needed no words attached to it. We are always watching. Ethan didn't show her those photographs, some things he decided a mother shouldn't have to carry. It was Thursday morning, the day the fake inspectors had promised to return with their full crew, when everything Ethan had been holding together by sheer stubborn will finally began to shift. He heard it before he saw it, a distant rumble, low and steady, like far-off thunder rolling across a clear sky, growing louder by the minute, resolving slowly into something unmistakable, something that made every hair on his arm stand on end. Engines, dozens of them, then hundreds, a sound so massive and sustained that Carol came running out of the kitchen with flowers still on her hands, eyes wide with alarm. Ethan, what is that? He was already moving toward the front window, hard hammering, and what he saw when he pulled back the curtain stole the breath clean out of his lungs. The road into Red Hollow, the single 2-lane highway that connected the town to the rest of the world, was filled from shoulder to shoulder with motorcycles, an unbroken river of chrome and leather stretching back farther than Ethan could see, engines roaring in a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. At the front of the formation, riding alone by a full length ahead of the pack, was a broad-shouldered man on a black and silver custom bike, gray beard neatly trimmed, sunglasses reflecting the morning light, a leather vest on his back marked with patches that told the story of a man who had earned every ounce of respect his position commanded. That's him, Ethan whispered. That's Cole Harrison. Carol grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. There must be hundreds of them. He said however many it takes. Ethan felt something in his chest crack open, some dam of fear and exhaustion, finally giving way to something that felt dangerously close to hope. Mom, I think he actually did it. I think he brought the whole club. The formation rolled to a stop outside the garage in a display of coordination that felt almost military engines cutting out one by one until the sudden silence rang louder than the roar had been, and Cole Harrison swung his leg off the bike and stood there for a long moment, staring at the garage at the scorched corner, still wrapped in blue tarp at the house behind it, his jaw working with an emotion so raw, Ethan could feel it from 30 feet away. Ethan walked out to meet him. Legs unsteady and up close, Cole Harrison was even more imposing than he'd looked from a distance, easily in his 50s, but built like a man 20 years younger. His face a roadmap of hard years and harder losses, eyes that carried a grief so old and so deep it had calcified into something unbreakable. Ethan Brooks, Cole said, and his voice, the same voice from the phone call, now carried a weight that seemed to physically press against the air between them. Mr. Harrison, Ethan's voice cracked and he found himself unexpectedly, embarrassingly close to tears. I have his dog tags. I have everything. It's inside. Cole's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, the hardened exterior cracked, revealing the raw, wounded brother underneath 26 years of unanswered grief, finally standing 3 feet away from the truth he'd spent his whole adult life chasing. Show me, he said, his voice barely holding steady. Please. Inside the garage, standing in front of the tarp-covered panhead, Cole Harrison went completely utterly still, the way a man goes still when the ground shifts beneath his feet and he's trying desperately not to fall. Ethan pulled the tarp back slowly, and Cole made a sound Ethan would never forget for the rest of his life, a low broken groan that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than his throat, the sound of 26 years of hope and grief and rage finally colliding in one single, devastating moment. Jesus! Cole's hand reached out trembling and touched the scarred metal frame with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. Jesus Christ, it's really his bike. I helped him rebuild this carburetor. I remember the day he bought it, he called me so excited he could barely talk straight. His fingers found the bullet holes in the frame, and his whole body went rigid. They shot him. They shot my brother and left his bike to rot in a junkyard for 26 years. Mr. Harrison. Cole. His voice was rough, thick with emotion he was visibly fighting to control. Just Cole. He straightened up, wiping a hand roughly across his face, and when he turned to look at Ethan, something had shifted in his expression, grief transmuting rapidly into a cold, focused determination. The tape. You said there was a recording. Ethan retrieved the recorder from the tool chest where he'd hidden it, and Cole's hand shook as he took it, turning it over carefully, staring at the cracked casing like it was the most precious object he'd ever held. I haven't listened to it, Ethan said. I wanted to wait. I don't know. It felt wrong to hear his voice before you did. Something in Cole's face broke fully open at that, a crack of pure emotion breaking through the hardened surface, and he gripped Ethan's shoulder with a hand that trembled slightly. You're a good man, Ethan Brooks. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that. My brother would have liked you. They found an old cassette player in the back of a closet, one that had belonged to Ethan's father, and the whole garage went silent as Cole pressed play with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the recorder twice. There was static first, a long stretch of ambient, bar noise glasses, clinking muffled conversation. Then clear as day, despite 26 years of decay, a voice neither of them had ever heard before, smooth and confident speaking, with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. The Hendricks parcel, the Coleman parcel, and once the old man out on Route 9 finally signs off, we'll have the entire corridor. Fuentes was the hard part, but that's handled now. Nobody questions a farm accident. A second voice, quieter, more cautious. And if someone does start asking questions, then we handle that too the same way we handled Fuentes. This land is worth $11 million once the water rights clear, and no two-bit farmer or nosy biker is going to stand in the way of that. Cole's whole body had gone rigid, his hands white-knuckled around the recorder, and Ethan watched a man who had survived 26 years of unbearable uncertainty finally hear in cold, casual detail exactly how his brother's murder had been discussed like a business inconvenience. The tape clicked off the recording, ending abruptly, likely where Jacob had been forced to stop it or risk discovery, and for a long, terrible moment, nobody in the garage said a word. Gerald Whitmore, Cole said finally, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. That's him. That's the voice that ordered my brother's death. We need to get this to someone who can actually use it. The FBI, the state attorney general, someone outside this county's jurisdiction. Ethan's mind was racing now, adrenaline burning through his exhaustion. If we go to the local sheriff, it'll disappear in an hour. Agreed. Cole's expression had hardened into something almost frightening in its focus. But first we need insurance, because the second Whitmore's people realize we have this tape, they're going to burn this whole town down, trying to stop it from getting out. He turned to look at Ethan, and something in his eyes carried the weight of a decision already made. Ethan, I want you to upload the recording online, tonight. Public, unmistakable, undeniable. Once it's out there forever. They can kill us, they can burn this garage to the ground, but they can't unring that bell. That's dangerous. If we do that without protection, you'll have protection. Cole's jaw set, and outside the garage, the low rumble of hundreds of idling engines seemed to answer the promise before he even finished speaking it. You have 450 of my brothers parked on this street right now, Ethan, and every single one of them would rather die than let anything happen to you or to your mother after what you just showed me. Upload it. Let the whole world hear Gerald Whitmore's voice ordering my brother's murder. And then let's see how brave he is when he's not hiding behind 26 years of silence. Carol appeared in the garage doorway. Then, having heard the recording through the thin walls, tears streaming freely down her face, and she crossed the room without hesitation and pulled Cole Harrison into an embrace that seemed to catch the massive man completely off guard. "I'm so sorry about your brother," she whispered. "I'm so sorry it took this long." Cole's composure finally shattered completely, and the hardened national president of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the country stood in a small Montana garage and wept openly for the first time in 26 years, held by a stranger's mother who understood better than almost anyone exactly what it meant to lose someone you loved and never get the truth about why. That night, with Cole's brothers stationed around the property in a perimeter that would have made any security professional envious, Ethan sat at his laptop with the recording loaded and ready, his finger hovering over the upload button, fully aware that the moment he pressed it, there would be no path back to the quiet, uncomplicated life he'd been living just 2 weeks earlier. "You don't have to be the one to do it," Cole said quietly, standing behind him. "I can post it from my own accounts. Take the target off your back." "No." Ethan's voice was steadier than he felt. "Jacob trusted me with this the moment I pulled that bike out of the junkyard, even if he didn't know my name yet. I want to be the one who finally lets him speak." He pressed the button. The video went up at 11:47 p.m. A simple post, no editing, no commentary beyond a caption that read, "This is a recording of Gerald Whitmore ordering the murder of Jacob Harrison in 1998. This has been buried for 26 years. It's time the truth came out." For the first 90 minutes, nothing happened. The view counter ticked up slowly, agonizingly, and Ethan sat frozen at his desk, Cole pacing behind him, both men watching the numbers with the same desperate hope, wondering if their gamble had simply vanished into the void of the internet, unnoticed and unheard. Then just after 1 a.m. something shifted. A local news account picked it up. Then a true crime podcast with 200,000 followers. Then a journalist who covered land use corruption on the West Coast, and within another hour the recording was spreading like wildfire, shared and reshared, the raw, damning audio of Gerald Whitmore's voice reaching further with every passing minute, completely beyond the control of anyone who might have wanted it to disappear. By 3 a.m. it had over 1 million views. "They can't stop this now," Cole said, staring at the screen with something like awe in his exhausted eyes. 26 years, and it took a broke mechanic and a burned-out motorcycle to finally break this thing wide open. But even as relief began to settle over the garage, even as Carol allowed herself, for the first time in days, a small and fragile smile, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that stole every ounce of that relief away in an instant. "You have no idea what you just started. Whitmore doesn't lose, he adapts. And now you've made this personal for a man who has spent 26 years learning exactly how far he's willing to go." Ethan showed the message to Cole, whose face darkened instantly, the brief moment of triumph replaced by grim, focused readiness. "Good," Cole said quietly. "Let him come. Let him bring everything he's got. Because he's not fighting a scared kid in a garage anymore, Ethan. He's fighting all of us now. And men like Gerald Whitmore have never once in the history of the world known what to do when the truth finally outnumbers their lies." Outside in the darkness beyond the garage, the low rumble of hundreds of motorcycle engines idled on standby. A wall of steel and loyalty that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. And somewhere out there in a house or an office, Ethan had never seen, Gerald Whitmore was waking up to the sound of his own recorded voice playing on every news channel in the state. Understanding, for the first time in 26 years, that the ghost he thought he'd buried in a Montana junkyard had just come roaring back to life with 450 riders standing behind it. By dawn, the fallout had already begun, faster and more violent than even Cole had predicted. A county judge, one whose name Ethan recognized from Jacob's journal, issued a hasty statement denying any connection to Whitmore, then abruptly went silent on all public channels. 2 local news anchors who had aired the story overnight found their segments pulled by morning, replaced with vague statements about verifying sources. A transparent attempt at containment that only fueled further outrage online as viewers noticed the sudden censorship and began asking louder questions. And then just after 7 that morning, 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up outside the garage, and 6 men in tactical vests stepped out flashing badges that identified them as county code enforcement and private security contractors carrying a court order that Ethan didn't recognize, demanding immediate access to the property under an emergency public safety provision. Cole Harrison stepped forward before Ethan could even open his mouth, his massive frame filling the garage doorway like an immovable wall. "You'll need to speak to my attorney before anyone sets foot on this property," he said, his voice calm, almost pleasant, in a way that somehow carried more menace than shouting ever could. "And you'll want to check that court order very carefully, because I've had 4 separate attorneys reviewing every piece of paperwork this county has generated in the last 48 hours, and every single one of them tells me you're standing on very, very thin legal ice." The lead security contractor's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking past Cole to the 450 motorcycles lined up along the street, engines silent but riders standing beside them in a display of quiet, unmistakable solidarity, arms crossed, watching, waiting. "This doesn't concern you," the contractor said stiffly. "This is a civil matter between the county and Mr. Brooks. It concerns me the moment somebody tries to touch anything belonging to my dead brother." Cole said, his voice dropping low and cold. "Try it. See what happens." The standoff lasted nearly 20 minutes, tension crackling through the morning air like static before a storm, until finally faced with the impossible math of 6 armed contractors against hundreds of riders who clearly weren't going anywhere, the lead man backed down, muttering something about coming back with proper documentation, and the vehicles pulled away in a retreat that felt to Ethan like the first real victory of the entire ordeal. "They're testing us," Cole said, watching the vehicles disappear down the road. "Whitmore's throwing everything he's got, seeing what sticks. Lawyers, media, intimidation. He's scared Ethan. Scared men make mistakes. What happens when the legal stuff doesn't work?" Cole's expression darkened, and he didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the street, the town beyond it, the mountains rising gray and indifferent in the distance. "Then he tries something more direct," he said finally. "And that's when things get dangerous for everybody, not just you and your mother." He was right, though even Cole couldn't have predicted just how quickly and how personally that danger would arrive. It happened that afternoon while Carol was walking back from the pharmacy 2 blocks from the garage, a route she'd walked 1,000 times over the years without a second thought. A car, not the black SUV, but a different vehicle, entirely dark blue, nondescript, slowed alongside her on the empty stretch of road near the old mill, and a man leaned out the passenger window with a phone raised, snapping photographs rapid fire before the car sped off, leaving Carol standing frozen on the sidewalk, hard-hammering, feeling for the first time with sickening clarity just how exposed she really was. She made it back to the garage, shaking so badly she could barely speak, and it took Ethan and 2 of Cole's men nearly 10 minutes to calm her down enough to explain what had happened. "They're escalating," Cole said grimly, already barking orders to a cluster of riders near the door, men who immediately began organizing into what Ethan slowly realized was a rotating security detail. "From now on, nobody in this family goes anywhere alone. Not to the store, not to church, not down the street to get the mail. Do you understand me?" "This is insane," Carol whispered, still trembling. "I can't even walk to the pharmacy in my own town." "I know." Cole's voice softened and he crouched down slightly to meet her eyes, a gesture of genuine gentleness that seemed to surprise even Carol, given how imposing the man looked. "I know this isn't the life you signed up for, ma'am, but I promise you on my brother's grave, nothing is going to happen to you or your son. Not while I have breath in my body and 450 men standing behind me." It was a promise Cole would be tested on sooner than any of them expected, because that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains and the temperature began to drop, a new visitor arrived at the edge of the property. Not in a car, not with an entourage, but on foot, walking slowly and deliberately up the driveway with his hands visible at his sides. An older man in an expensive coat that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of chrome and leather that now surrounded the garage. Ethan recognized him instantly from photographs he'd found during his research, and his stomach dropped straight through the floor. Gerald Whitmore had come to Red Hollow himself. The riders tensed immediately, several of them stepping forward to block his path, but Whitmore raised his hand slightly, an unsettling, practiced calm on his face, the expression of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted through charm, money, and quiet menace, and clearly believed this situation was no different. "I'm unarmed," he called out, his voice smooth and carrying pitch to reach every ear on the property. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Brooks and Mr. Harrison. Just a conversation. Surely even men like yourselves can extend that courtesy to a neighbor." Cole's face went absolutely rigid, a stillness far more frightening than any outburst could have been, and he walked forward slowly, positioning himself directly between Whitmore and the garage between Whitmore and Ethan, between Whitmore and Carol standing frozen in the doorway behind them. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here," Cole said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "I've got a lot of nerve because I've got nothing left to lose, Mr. Harrison." Whitmore's smile was thin, cold, utterly without warmth. "You've made quite a mess of things. A recording taken wildly out of context, a young man's paranoid conspiracy theory, and suddenly I'm being tried in the court of public opinion for a tragedy that happened before most of your writers were even born." His eyes flicked toward Ethan and something calculating passed behind them. "I'd like to offer a resolution. One final offer generous beyond anything reasonable to make this entire unpleasant chapter disappear. My brother is dead because of you." Cole said, his voice shaking now with barely contained rage. "There is no amount of money in the world that makes that disappear." Whitmore's calm facade flickered just slightly, just enough for Ethan to catch a glimpse of the ruthless calculation underneath. "Your brother made a choice 26 years ago to involve himself in matters far beyond his understanding. I take no pleasure in what happened, but it happened, and no amount of motorcycles parked in this driveway is going to change history, Mr. Harrison. What it will change, however, is the future yours, this young man's, and everyone standing behind you, if you don't think very carefully about what you do next." The threat hung in the cold evening air, and Ethan felt every muscle in his body go taut, felt the whole property seem to hold its breath in unison. 450 men standing silent and coiled, waiting for a signal that never quite came, because Cole Harrison in that moment did something none of them expected. He laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was low, bitter, and utterly without humor, and it seemed to unsettle Whitmore more than any shouted threat could have. "You think this is about money or reputation, or you being embarrassed on the evening news?" Cole took a step closer, close enough, now that Whitmore's practiced composure finally cracked close enough that the old man took an involuntary step back. "This is about a 29-year-old kid who believed in doing the right thing so much that he spent the last months of his life hiding evidence inside his own motorcycle, praying somebody someday would have the courage to find it. And you know what Whitmore somebody did?" Cole's voice dropped to something almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying than rage ever could have. "It's over. Not because of me, not because of these riders. Because a broke kid with nothing to lose refused to look away. That's the story that's going to outlive both of us, and there's not one single thing left in your power that can change that." Whitmore stood there for a long moment, his composure visibly cracking under the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. "This isn't finished," he said, but the words came out hollow, brittle, the desperate bluff of a man who had just realized, standing in a driveway surrounded by 450 riders, and a wall of undeniable evidence that his 26 years of careful, murderous silence had finally irreversibly run out. He turned and walked back down the driveway, his expensive coat suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume on a man whose empire was already beginning to crumble beneath him, and Ethan watched him go with his heart still hammering, adrenaline and disbelief warring in his chest. "Was that it?" he asked quietly. "Is it over?" Cole watched Whitmore's car disappear down the road, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying a weariness that spoke of 26 years finally reaching some kind of breaking point. "No," he said quietly. "Men like that don't just walk away. He's going to go home tonight and make calls, pull every string he's got left, try one more time to bury this before it buries him." He turned to look at Ethan, and something in his expression carried both warning and steel. "Tomorrow's going to be the fight that decides everything. I can feel it. So tonight we get some rest, because tomorrow, Ethan Brooks, we finish what your discovery started one way or another." Behind them, the garage light flickered against the tarp-covered shape of a 26-year-old motorcycle that had somehow become the center of a war. Neither of them had chosen, but both of them were now bound to finish, and somewhere out there in the gathering dark, Gerald Whitmore was already making the calls that would determine just how far he was willing to go to keep his empire from collapsing entirely. Cole's phone rang at 4 a.m, and the sound cut through the fragile quiet of the garage like a blade. Ethan startled awake in the chair he'd fallen asleep in, watching Cole's face harden as he listened, his knuckles going white around the phone. When Cole's voice was flat, controlled in a way that scared Ethan more than shouting would have. "Where is she now? What happened?" Ethan was on his feet instantly, adrenaline burning through the last traces of sleep. Cole covered the phone with his palm. Your neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, 2 houses down. Somebody just tried to convince her she needed to evacuate. Immediately gas leak, no time to grab anything. Get in the car right now. His eyes were hard as flint. One of my men was doing a perimeter check and caught it before it went further. Fake utility worker, fake badge, tried to get an elderly widow alone in an unmarked vehicle at 4 in the morning. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. They're going after everybody, not just us. They're going after anyone connected to you, anyone who might have information, anyone who might make a good hostage or a good scapegoat. Cole ended the call and immediately began dialing another number, his jaw set like granite. Whitmore's panicking. This is what a cornered animal looks like, Ethan. It gets more dangerous, not less. Within 20 minutes, 6 riders were stationed along the street in a rotating watch, and Cole personally walked down to check on Mrs. Delgado, who answered her door in a housecoat, shaking, clutching a rolling pin like it might actually protect her from whatever had nearly happened. They said there was a gas leak. She kept repeating, her voice thin and frightened. They said I had to come right now. You're safe, ma'am, Cole told her gently, crouching slightly to meet her eyes the same way he had with Carol days before. I've got men posted outside your house till morning. Nobody's coming near you again. Word spread through Floyd Hollow fast after that, faster than Ethan could have anticipated. And by sunrise, the mood of the entire town had shifted in a way that felt seismic. People who had crossed the street to avoid Carol just days earlier were suddenly showing up at the garage with casseroles and coffee, murmuring apologies, admitting they'd believed the news reports without questioning them, admitting they should have known better than to doubt a family they'd known for 20 years. I'm sorry, said Diane Fletcher, who ran the flower shop on Main Street and had been one of the loudest voices repeating the arson rumors. She stood in the driveway, wringing her hands, unable to meet Carol's eyes. I heard what almost happened to Rosa Delgado. I heard these people are trying to hurt anyone who gets close to the truth, and I'm ashamed I believed the lies so easily. Carol, exhausted and hollowed out from days of fear, still found it in herself to reach out and squeeze the other woman's hand. We're all scared, Diane. Fear makes people believe things they shouldn't. Just be careful. That's all I ask. But the goodwill of the town, however heartening, did nothing to slow the machine grinding forward against them, and by mid-morning, the true scope of Whitmore's counterattack revealed itself in a way that made even Cole go pale. A national news segment aired at 10 a.m. slickly produced, featuring a well-dressed attorney speaking on behalf of concerned citizens, painting an elaborate narrative that reframed the entire situation. According to the segment, the audio recording was almost certainly doctored, an act of defamation orchestrated by a motorcycle gang using an emotionally vulnerable young man to extort a respected local businessman and philanthropist. Gerald Whitmore, the segment reminded viewers, had donated millions to local schools and hospitals over the decades. Surely a man of such civic generosity could not be capable of the crimes being alleged by a mob of bikers who had descended on a small town uninvited. They're rewriting this story in real time, Ethan said, watching the segment with his stomach churning. They're turning us into the villains. That's exactly what desperate men do, Cole said grimly, though Ethan noticed the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw kept clenching and unclenching. They can't disprove the tape, so they attack the messenger. Classic move. Doesn't mean it isn't working. It was working. By noon, the comment sections beneath the original video had turned poisonous. An organized wave of accounts, clearly coordinated, clearly paid flooding. Every platform with claims that the recording was AI-generated, that Ethan Brooks had a history of instability, that the whole thing was an elaborate scheme by an outlaw motorcycle club looking to shake down a wealthy target. Ethan watched his own name get dragged through digital mud by strangers who knew nothing about him, and something in his chest twisted with a helplessness he hadn't felt since his father's funeral. How do we fight this? He asked, staring at his laptop with something close to despair. We can't outshout a professional PR machine. Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring out the garage window at the line of motorcycles stretching down the road, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision forming in real time. We don't fight noise with more noise, he said. We fight it with something they can't spin, something undeniable. He turned to look at Ethan, and something sharp and focused had settled into his eyes. Walter Reyes, the old deputy who saw the original file, would he testify on camera, on the record, publicly? Ethan's heart jumped. I don't know. He's terrified. He's been terrified for 26 years. Then we need to ask him, because a doctored recording is easy to dismiss. A retired law enforcement officer describing evidence tampering under his own name is a lot harder to bury. Cole was already moving toward the door. Take me to him, now. They found Walter on his porch exactly where Ethan had first found him weeks earlier, and the old veteran's face went through a rapid series of emotions when he saw Cole Harrison climbing the steps behind Ethan. Recognition from the news coverage followed swiftly by fear. I heard what you're doing to this town. Walter said, his cane trembling slightly against the porch boards. I don't want any part of it. Mr. Reyes, my brother is dead because men like Gerald Whitmore have spent decades making sure people like you stay too afraid to speak. Cole's voice was gentle despite the words carrying none of the menace he'd shown Whitmore the night before. I understand fear. I've watched it eat away at good men for 26 years. But I'm asking you, one veteran to a man who served his community, to help us finish this. Not for me. For every family after yours who might lose someone to men who think money buys silence forever. Walter's eyes filled with tears, decades of buried guilt suddenly rising to the surface all at once. I've had to live with what I didn't say for 26 years, he said, his voice cracking. I watched a young family move away from this town because they got too close to the truth about Jacob's case. I watched Pete Miller hide that bike out of pure terror. I've been complicit in this silence my whole adult life, and I hated myself for it every single day. Then help us end it, Ethan said quietly. Please, Walter. You're the only one who saw the original file before it disappeared. Walter sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the mountains, and when he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something resembling resolve. I'll do it, he said. God help me, I'll do it. Get your camera. The interview they filmed that afternoon shot simply on Ethan's phone, with Walter sitting straight backed in his porch chair, ran 11 minutes, and it detonated across the internet within hours in a way that no amount of paid comments or slick news segments could contain. Walter described in steady, deliberate detail the blood evidence that had mysteriously vanished from the evidence locker, the witness statements that had been altered after the fact, the sheriff who had closed a murder investigation in record time, despite glaring inconsistencies in the rattlesnake in his mailbox 2 weeks after he'd started asking questions. I was a coward for 26 years, Walter said, staring directly into the camera, his voice unwavering despite the visible tremor in his hands. I had a wife and a daughter, and I let fear win. But that boy's brother has been buried in silence long enough, and I'd rather die telling the truth now than die a coward who never said a word. The video spread faster than the original recording had picked up by legitimate journalists, who recognized immediately that a named on-record former law enforcement officer describing evidence tampering was an entirely different category of story than an anonymous audio clip. Within hours, calls for a state-level investigation began trending, and a congresswoman from the district posted a statement demanding the state attorney general open a formal inquiry into the handling of the original 1998 case. They can't spin this, Cole said, watching the numbers climb with something like fierce satisfaction. A dead man's tape is one thing. A living witness with a name and a face is something else entirely. But the walls closing in on Gerald Whitmore only made him more dangerous, not less. And the proof of that arrived just before sunset when Ethan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and a voice he'd never heard before spoke with a calm, clinical menace that turned his blood to ice. Mr. Brooks, you don't know me, but I know a great deal about you. The voice was smooth, educated, utterly devoid of emotion. I'm calling as a courtesy, one professional to another, though I understand you're not much of a professional yet. Your mother takes a walk most evenings around this time, doesn't she? Down by the old mill road. Ethan's blood ran cold. Who is this? Someone who wants you to understand and that this situation has consequences beyond internet videos and news cycles. Mr. Whitmore is a patient man, but patience has limits, and today you crossed one of them. A pause, deliberate and chilling. Withdraw the claims, issue a retraction. Tell the world the recording was fabricated and this all goes away. Refuse, and I promise you the consequences will be far more permanent than a fire in a storage room. The line went dead, and Ethan stood, frozen in the garage phone still pressed to his ear, his heart hammering so violently he could hear it in his own skull. Ethan, Cole's voice sharp with alarm, cut through the ringing in his ears. What happened? You've gone white as a sheet. They know about Mom's evening walks. They just threatened her directly. Ethan's voice came out shaking. Cole, where is she right now? Cole was already moving, shouting orders to the men stationed around the property, and the answer came back within seconds, delivered by a rider sprinting from the perimeter with his radio crackling. She left for her walk 15 minutes ago. Nobody stopped her because it's her regular route we didn't know. Find her now! Cole's voice cracked like a whip, and a dozen engines roared to life simultaneously, riders scrambling to bikes, fanning out toward the mill road in a chaos of urgency that made Ethan's stomach drop through the floor. He ran. He didn't think. Didn't wait for a bike, just ran down the driveway and onto the road toward the mill. His lungs burning, his mind screaming his mother's name over and over, terror clawing up his throat with every desperate stride. Behind him, he could hear the roar of motorcycles catching up, passing him, spreading out along the route, and somewhere ahead in the deepening dusk, he could just make out a figure standing frozen on the old mill road, and beside her, far too close, a dark sedan idling with its passenger door hanging open. Mom. His voice tore out of him, raw and desperate, and he saw Carol turn, saw the fear on her face, saw a man stepping out of the sedan's driver's seat, and for one agonizing, endless second, Ethan Brooks believed with absolute certainty that he was about to watch his mother be taken in front of his own eyes. Then the world exploded with sound and motion riders converging. From three directions at once, engines screaming, and the man by the sedan froze, calculating odds that had just become impossible. And in the space of a heartbeat, he dove back into the car and sped off down the road, tires screeching, disappearing around the bend before a single rider could close the distance. Ethan reached his mother, seconds later gasping, and pulled her into his arms so hard she nearly stumbled. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? No, I'm okay. Carol was shaking violently, clinging to him. A car pulled up and a man got out and said he needed directions, and something about the way he was looking at me. Ethan, something was wrong, and then all these engines just... She broke off sobbing now, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Cole arrived moments later, dismounting before his bike had even fully stopped his face, a mask of barely controlled fury. Is she... She's okay, they ran. Ethan's voice shook with the aftermath of terror. Cole, they were going to take her. In broad daylight, 15 minutes after threatening me on the phone. Cole's jaw worked, his eyes hard as stone, and when he spoke, his voice carried a finality that sent a chill down Ethan's spine despite the relief of his mother's safety. That's it, he said. That's the last line they get to cross. Whitmore just declared war on a mother walking down her own street, and now he's going to learn exactly what happens when you do that to a Harrison family. They walked Carol back to the garage, surrounded by a wall of riders so dense it felt like being escorted by an army. And once she was safely inside, sedated with tea, and wrapped in blankets by two of the older riders' wives who had arrived days earlier, and taken to fussing over her like family, Cole pulled Ethan aside, his expression grim and resolute. I'm calling the state attorney general's office myself tonight, Cole said. Not through lawyers, not through statements, directly. I know someone there, an old contact from a case years back. We're done playing defense, Ethan. We push everything we have right now tonight before Whitmore gets desperate enough to try something even worse. The call happened at 9 p.m. on speakerphone in the garage with Ethan Walter and Pete Miller, who had finally worked up the courage to come shaking but resolute, carrying with him a small ledger he'd kept hidden for 26 years, one that recorded in his own careful handwriting every strange visitor in every unmarked vehicle that had come asking about the panhead over the decades, all gathered around the phone as Cole laid out everything they had. The voice on the other end, a deputy attorney general named Patricia Nolan, listened without interruption for nearly 20 minutes, and when she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from professional skepticism to something sharper, more focused. Mr. Harrison, if even half of what you're describing is verifiable, this goes far beyond a cold case reopening. This is racketeering conspiracy to commit murder, decades of fraud touching multiple government offices. A pause heavy with implication. I'm going to need everything you have sent to my office tonight, and I'm going to need protection arranged for every witness involved. This is about to become very big, very fast, and I need all of you safe before that happens. We've got protection, Cole said grimly, glancing toward the window where dozens of his riders stood watch in the darkness. 450 men worth of it, Just get us the investigation, ma'am, and we'll handle keeping everyone alive long enough to see it through. By midnight, the evidence had been transmitted. The journal scanned page by page the recording Walter's sworn statement, Pete's ledger of decades of suspicious visitors, and Patricia Nolan confirmed that a formal state investigation would be announced by morning, with federal partners likely joining, given the scope of interstate land fraud implications. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Ethan allowed himself a single fragile breath of relief. "It's actually happening," he said quietly, sitting on the cold garage floor beside the pan head, running his hand along its scarred frame. "Jacob, it's actually happening." But relief in this fight, Ethan was learning, never lasted long, and the proof of that arrived at 3 a.m. when a rider on perimeter watch burst into the garage, breathless radio crackling in his hand. "Cole, you need to see this." They gathered outside, and Ethan's stomach dropped at what he saw illuminated by the property's floodlights, spray-painted across the side of the garage's undamaged wall in violent red letters. Work that had somehow been completed despite dozens of riders standing watch, a message so brazen it could only have been meant as a final desperate act of psychological warfare. "Last warning, back off or she dies next time." Carol, roused by the commotion, stood in the doorway, staring at the words with a face gone completely bloodless. And Cole's fury in that moment was something Ethan had never witnessed in another human being, a controlled, icy rage that radiated off him like heat from a furnace. "They got past 450 men to paint that," Cole said, his voice deadly quiet, "which means either they're far bolder than we thought or—" He stopped, his eyes narrowing, and turned slowly to scan the faces of the riders gathered around him, a horrible realization dawning across his features. Or someone on the inside let them through. The accusation hung in the cold night air like a blade, and Ethan felt his stomach twist violently. Because if Cole was right, if Whitmore's reach extended even into the ranks of 450 riders who had crossed state lines out of loyalty and brotherhood, then nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was truly safe anymore. And the war that had started with a rusted motorcycle in a condemned junkyard had just revealed a darker, far more dangerous dimension that none of them had seen coming. The accusation hung there only a moment before a voice broke through the tension, shaky but resolute. "It was me." Every head turned. Standing at the edge of the floodlight's reach was one of the younger riders, a man named Danny Ochoa, who'd arrived with the second wave 2 days earlier, his face pale and his hands trembling, as he stepped forward, unable to meet Cole's eyes. "Danny?" Cole's voice was low, dangerous, the sound of a man bracing for a betrayal he couldn't yet fully comprehend. "Explain, right now." "They got to my sister." Danny's voice cracked, tears spilling freely now. 2 days ago, Whitmore's people found her, threatened her kids, said if I didn't leave a gap in the east perimeter for 10 minutes tonight, they'd hurt her babies. I didn't know what else to do, Cole. I didn't know who to tell. I've never had to choose between my brothers and my own blood before. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on dozens of riders shifting uneasily, torn between fury at the breach and a raw, aching understanding of the impossible position Danny had been forced into. Cole stood motionless for a long moment, his jaw working, and when he finally spoke, his voice had softened just enough to reveal the man beneath the command. "You should have come to me the second they touched your family," Cole said. "That's what brotherhood means, Danny. Not carrying it alone, not making a deal with the devil because you thought you had no other choice." He stepped closer, gripping Danny's shoulder hard enough to make the younger man flinch. "Where's your sister right now?" "Billings, with her kids. I don't know if she's safe." "She will be." Cole was already turning barking orders, and within minutes, 4 riders were mounted and pulling out into the dark, racing toward Billings with a mission that left no room for failure. "Nobody touches this man," Cole added loud enough for the whole perimeter to hear. "He made a mistake out of fear for people he loves. That doesn't make him our enemy. It makes him proof of exactly how far Whitmore is willing to go to save himself." Ethan watched the exchange with his heart still pounding, the spray-painted threat on the garage wall glaring red under the floodlights, and something in him understood with sudden and terrible clarity that Gerald Whitmore's reach had just proven itself far more insidious than brute force alone. He wasn't just fighting with money and lawyers and fake inspectors. He was fighting by finding the weakest, most human point in anyone's armor and pressing on it until it broke. "This isn't going to stop," Ethan said quietly, staring at the threat on the wall. "Even if the state investigation moves forward, even if everything we sent them holds up, he's going to keep finding people to threaten until somebody actually gets hurt." Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. Cole's voice had gone hard again, the brief moment of compassion for Danny replaced by cold, focused resolve. Patricia Nolan said federal partners were getting involved. I'm calling her back right now tonight, and I'm telling her this just became an active threat against witnesses. That changes everything. That gets people moving faster than any amount of evidence ever could. The call went out at 4 in the morning, and by the time the sun crept gray over the mountains, Red Hollow had transformed into something out of a story nobody in that town would ever quite believe. Even years later, even after they'd told it 100 times over coffee at the diner. 2 unmarked federal vehicles rolled into town just after 7, followed by a convoy of state police cruisers, and Patricia Nolan herself stepped out of the lead car, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who took one look at the spray-painted threat still glaring on the garage wall and turned to her team with an expression that left no doubt about how seriously she was taking this. I want witness protection details on the Brooks family on Walter Reyes and on this Ochoa family in Billings within the hour, she said, already moving toward the garage. And I want everything Gerald Whitmore owns frozen by end of day. Every account, every property, every shell company we can trace. This man does not get another 24 hours to threaten a single soul. Ethan stood in the driveway watching federal agents move through his father's garage with a strange, disorienting mixture of relief and disbelief. The surreal weight of watching the machinery of actual justice finally begin turning after weeks of feeling like he was screaming into a void. Mr. Brooks. Patricia Nolan approached him directly, extending a hand he shook with fingers that hadn't quite stopped trembling. I want you to know what you did finding this evidence, refusing to back down under threat, getting it into the right hands that took extraordinary courage. Most people would have taken the money and walked away. I couldn't, Ethan said simply. Not once I understood what really happened to Jacob Harrison. Well, because you didn't, we now have enough to move on Whitmore today. Not next month, not after some drawn-out legal battle. Today. She glanced toward the recorder, now bagged and tagged as evidence being carried carefully to a federal vehicle. This case has been sitting cold for 26 years because everyone who might have blown it open was too scared, too compromised, or too dead to do it. You changed that. The arrest happened just after 2 that afternoon, and Ethan watched it unfold on a live news feed alongside Cole, Carol, Walter, and Pete, all of them crowded around a laptop in the garage with a tension so thick it felt physical. Federal agents converged on Gerald Whitmore's sprawling estate outside the county seat, and the footage, shaky and distant, from a news helicopter showed the old man being let out in handcuffs. His expensive coat rumpled his face, a mask of stunned, hollow disbelief. The practiced confidence that had carried him through 26 years of untouchable power finally completely gone. 26 years, Cole said softly, watching the screen with tears standing unashamed in his eyes. 26 years, Jacob. We got him. Carol reached over and took his hand, and Cole gripped it back like a lifeline. And for a long moment, nobody in that garage said a word. All of them simply watching justice arrive, finally decades too late for Jacob Harrison himself, but not too late for the truth of what happened to him. The days that followed unfolded in a blur that Ethan would later struggle to fully piece back together in order. The federal investigation expanded rapidly, sweeping up a county judge, the retired assessor with the suspicious lake house, and 3 attorneys who had helped launder stolen land through shell companies for over a decade. Richard Kessler, the smooth-talking man who had first tried to buy the Panhead for $20,000, was arrested attempting to flee the state with 2 suitcases of cash and a passport under a name that wasn't his own. The black SUV, it turned out, had been registered to a private security firm on Whitmore's payroll, one that was now under its own separate federal investigation for the harassment campaign waged against Ethan and his family. And the fake sheriff who had closed Jacob's case decades earlier, Ray Doyle, long retired and living quietly 2 states away, was found and questioned, eventually admitting under the weight of overwhelming evidence that he had been paid $50,000 in 1998 to bury the investigation, and had lived every day since in the particular quiet misery of a man who knew exactly what he'd done and had simply chosen year after year not to think about it. I always wondered when it would catch up to me. Doyle reportedly told investigators, according to Patricia Nolan, who shared the detail with Ethan and Cole over coffee one evening as the case continued unfolding. 26 years, and I never stopped waiting for that phone call. News of the case spread far beyond Red Hollow, far beyond Montana entirely, and within a week, Ethan found himself fielding calls from national outlets, documentary producers, and true crime podcasts, all of them wanting the full story of the broke mechanic who'd cracked open a decades-old murder conspiracy while trying to save his mother's house. He turned down most of them overwhelmed and still processing everything that had happened, but he agreed to one interview, a modest local piece, because he wanted the story told simply and honestly without sensationalism, in a way that honored what it had actually cost to get here. "Why did you keep going?" the reporter asked him, sitting across from him in the garage that had started this entire journey. The panhead, now cleaned and gleaming restoration, finally resumed after weeks of chaos. "You could have taken the money. Multiple times you could have walked away wealthy and safe." Ethan looked at the motorcycle for a long moment before answering, running his thumb over one of the healed bullet scars in the frame, a wound that would remain visible forever, a permanent reminder of everything this machine had witnessed and survived. "Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about the money," he said finally. "It became about a man named Jacob Harrison who died trying to do the right thing, and a brother who never stopped looking for him, and a town that had been living under a shadow for 26 years without even fully realizing it. I couldn't put that back in the ground once I understood what it meant. I don't think anybody could have." The trial, when it finally came months later, was swift and merciless in its clarity. The sheer weight of evidence, Jacob's journal, the recording, Walter's testimony, Pete's ledger, and the financial trail, federal investigators had unearthed once they knew where to look, leaving no room for the kind of doubt that might once have let a man like Gerald Whitmore slip through the cracks of a justice system he had spent decades learning how to manipulate. He was convicted on charges spanning murder conspiracy, racketeering, and decades of fraud, and the sentence handed down ensured that Gerald Whitmore would spend whatever years remained to him exactly where men like him belonged. Cole Harrison was there for every single day of that trial, sitting in the front row, and on the final day after the verdict was read, and the courtroom finally exhaled the tension it had been holding for weeks, he walked outside into the sunlight and simply stood there for a long moment, his eyes closed, his face turned upward, and Ethan, standing beside him, understood without needing to ask that this was a man finally, after 26 years, allowing himself to feel something like peace. "He can rest now," Cole said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "My brother can finally rest." Back in Red Hollow, the town that had nearly torn itself apart with fear and suspicion, slowly, steadily began to heal. Diane Fletcher's flower shop hosted a small memorial for Jacob Harrison, a modest gathering that drew far more people than anyone expected. Neighbors who had never met the man, but who understood now in a way they hadn't before exactly what his sacrifice had ultimately protected. Pete Miller finally, after 26 years, stopped flinching every time a stranger's car pulled into his salvage yard, and he took to telling anyone who'd listen the story of the day a stubborn kid named Ethan Brooks refused to leave a rusted motorcycle buried where it didn't belong. Walter Reyes, for his part, found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing for 26 years. A kind of forgiveness for himself, the quiet guilt he'd carried since the rattlesnake in his mailbox, finally beginning to loosen its grip. He started sitting on his porch again in the evenings, but now instead of watching the road with wary, hunted eyes, he simply watched the sunset, and sometimes Ethan would stop by, and they'd sit together in comfortable silence. Two men who understood, in their different ways, exactly what it cost to finally tell the truth. And Carol Brooks, who had spent weeks terrified to walk to the pharmacy alone, slowly rediscovered her town, her neighbors, her life, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer flinching at unfamiliar cars. The $11,000 that had started this entire nightmare became in the end the smallest part of the story, dwarfed entirely by everything else that had been uncovered and repaired along the way. The restored panhead, once its restoration was finally completed months later, sold at a specialty auction to a museum dedicated to American motorcycle history for a sum that cleared every debt the family had and left enough besides to finally give Carol the security she'd been praying for since her husband's death. But money, Ethan had learned by then, was never really the point, not anymore. The real payment came in other forms in Cole Harrison, becoming unofficially and then very officially something like family, showing up for Thanksgiving that year with 36 of his brothers and enough food to feed the entire street, laughing with Carol in the kitchen like they'd known each other their whole lives. It came in Danny Ochoa's sister and her kids safe now, sending a handwritten card every Christmas that Cole kept pinned to the wall of his own home, a reminder of the one dark moment in an otherwise unbreakable brotherhood. It came in Red Hollow itself, a town that had learned the hard way exactly what it looked like when good people finally refused to stay silent. On the one-year anniversary of the day, Ethan had first pulled that motorcycle out of Pete Miller's condemned scrapyard. Cole Harrison rode back into Red Hollow this time with far fewer riders, a smaller gathering, more personal, more like family coming home than an army arriving for war. They gathered at the cemetery on the edge of town, where a modest memorial stone had finally been placed for Jacob Harrison decades after his death. Bearing his name and dates and a single line that Cole had chosen himself, he told the truth, and the truth outlived every lie built to bury it. Standing there in the quiet morning light, surrounded by riders who had crossed hundreds of miles, for a man most of them had never met, Ethan felt the full weight of everything that had happened settle into something he could finally fully understand. He had come to that condemned scrapyard as a desperate 22-year-old trying to save his mother's house, armed with nothing but stubbornness and a mechanic's eye for hidden value. He was leaving that chapter of his life as something else entirely, a man who had helped bring a murderer to justice, who had given a grieving brother the closure he'd spent 26 years chasing, who had reminded an entire community what it looked like when courage finally outlasted fear. "Your father would be proud of you," Carol told him that evening back home, sitting together on the porch steps of the house they'd nearly lost, watching the last of Cole's riders pull away down the road, engines fading slowly into the distance until the night fell quiet again. "I know I haven't said that enough these past months. I was so scared, Ethan. I was so scared we were going to lose everything, including each other. But I've never been prouder of anything in my life than I am of you." Ethan leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, exhausted in the deep, satisfying way that comes only after a battle finally truly won. "I didn't do it alone, Mom. I couldn't have. Not the Harleys, not Cole, not Walter or Pete finally finding their courage. It took all of it." "Maybe that's the whole lesson," Carol said quietly, watching the stars begin to emerge over the mountains that had watched over Red Hollow through all of it, the silence, the fear, and finally the truth. "None of us can carry the weight of injustice alone. But when enough people refuse to look away, when enough people choose courage over comfort, even the deepest, oldest secrets don't stand a chance." The garage still stands today at the edge of Red Hollow, Montana. The scorched section long since rebuilt, the sign above the door repainted in the same lettering Frank Brooks had chosen decades earlier. Ethan Brooks still runs it, though these days he's rarely short on customers, word having spread far and wide about the mechanic who once rebuilt a bike nobody wanted, and in doing so rebuilt an entire town's faith in the truth. And every August, on the anniversary of Jacob Harrison's disappearance, the low rumble of motorcycles still rolls into Red Hollow. Hundreds of them, chrome catching the late summer sun brothers, who never stopped believing that some debts, no matter how old, always eventually come due. What began as scrap metal in a condemned scrapyard became something far greater than anyone could have imagined, proof that the truth, however deeply buried, however many powerful men conspire to keep it silent, never truly disappears. It waits. And when the right person finally has the courage to dig it up, no empire built on lies can survive what it unleashes. Jacob Harrison's voice was finally heard 26 years after it was meant to be silenced forever, and justice, however long delayed, arrived exactly as certain and unstoppable as 450 engines roaring as one down a quiet Montana road.